Welcome everybody. This is our fourth Neurodiversity Masterclass, and I'm delighted that you're all able to join us this morning from whatever part of the globe that you're attending. My name is Fiona McNicholas. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist working in clinical services, but also working at University College Dublin. And I'm delighted to host this session today on behalf of a group of colleagues who are establishing or have just recently established a neurodiversity working project in UCD, and in an effort to try and promote a better understanding and develop a strengths-based conversation around the whole topic of neurodiversity. And I guess what better person than to contribute to the presentation other than our speaker today, Beth Radulski. Beth is somebody who has completed her Bachelor in Arts in International Development and subsequently continued with a first-class honours degree in Sociology, Gender, Sexuality and Diversity Studies before moving on to her area of PhD research, which is masking the active concealment of autistic traits with neurotypical behaviour, and researching that area for her PhD. Beth is also a lecturer at La Trobe University for the last number of years in Melbourne, and is coming to us from there this evening, her time, and is also the first project officer in the neurodiversity office there. So we'll be looking forward to hearing a little bit more about that, Beth. So Beth, over to you, and thank you very much for giving up your time to present to us.
Thank you so much. So I'll just share my presentation with everyone, and thank you so much for the introduction. So I just wanted to start off mentioning, which I think Fiona may have already mentioned, but I always like starting to make sure I mentioned that I am autistic myself, and I'm going to be delivering this presentation, and that may come up a few times over the course of the presentation. So I always just like to make sure everybody's aware of that from the get-go. And if you notice me hand flapping or rocking, don't be concerned. I'm just really focused and excited about what I'm saying. So with that said, I'll go ahead and get started. And I do just want to give a little bit of a content warning because we're going to cover some themes that might be distressing to some people in terms of mental health and well-being, particularly in relation to stigma against autistic people and other minority groups. So bear that in mind, and if anyone needs to step away at any point, please feel absolutely free to do so. So to get started, I just want to refresh everyone's memory. Most attendees are probably familiar with the medical model of disability, but I thought it's always good to start off. So I've created a little visualization here. And I think it's really important to establish what the usual approach is to understanding autism and neurodiversity and inclusion for autistic people. So in this approach, we tend to assume that there is one normal, healthy brain and a spectrum of disordered brains. And the aim here is to get the disordered brains or disordered people as close as possible to what we call the normal neurotypical brain so that they can achieve inclusion and participation in society. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this model throughout, but also challenge it later on in the presentation with more of a social model. So when we talk about this medical model, I mean, as Fiona mentioned, I'm a sociologist, so I'm very interested in how our understandings of things like autism are shaped by culture and history and our social surroundings. So where did we get the idea that autism is a disorder? How does this relate to autistic people's experiences of navigating society and seeking inclusion? So I think, you know, as many of us in this seminar probably have quite a significant interest in neurodiversity, that's probably why you're here. But when we talk about issues of inclusion, it's important to understand the broader cultural context. How do most people probably think about autism? What does that look like? Where did that idea come from? So that medical model is really, really prevalent in discourse in society and the public more broadly. So when we look at, you know, news headlines current issues in relation to autism, it's very medicalized, and there's very much an idea that autism is a medical ailment that is preventing an otherwise normal person from achieving success and participation. So as a sociologist and as an autistic person, I want to problematize this idea. And I think it's really important to note that this idea that there's one standard of normal and a spectrum of disorders or inferior ways of being, this is not the first time we've seen that. We've seen that with race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion. And when we think about the idea that the only way to achieve participation and success is for these minority groups to assimilate with a normative standard, that tends to actually perpetuate inequality a lot of the time. So when we talk about inclusion in education and workplaces, we need to factor this in. How can we learn from past lessons or even ongoing lessons that we're seeing in other realms of culture and society? So this is where my interest in masking really comes from. You know, this idea of, if on the outside I look neurotypical or I'm indistinguishable as autistic, why has that generally been seen as the hallmark of success? Why do we see that as a good thing? So I think it's really important to start off by just defining what masking is and what it looks like. So masking is really the purposeful concealment of autistic traits in an effort to pass as non-autistic. So we define this differently in different realms. You know, psychologically, it's traditionally, up until the last couple of years, it's predominantly been talked about in terms of evading diagnosis, not looking autistic. Socially, it might mean you call somebody normal or high functioning. The idea that they're only mildly autistic, and I use these terms with quotations because they're not terms that I myself would prefer, but I want to acknowledge that they're quite common. And economically, in an employment setting, for example, it might mean looking professional, fitting in at the workplace, hiding distress that might be caused by an environment. So masking can take many different forms. It involves both the suppression of autistic traits like hand flapping or rocking back and forth, and it also involves replacing those traits with more socially accepted or privileged even behaviors. So I see, as a sociologist, a number of ways that the field of sociology can contribute to creating better understandings of masking as an issue of very high relevance to neurodiversity. So psychologically, when we've defined masking in the psychology literature on autism, I think one of the best definitions I've read is from Hull in 2017, describing it as a form of acting. Success here is defined as simply not appearing autistic, even though under the surface or behind maintaining such appearances, autistic people may report high levels of subjective stress, anxiety, or exhaustion. Now, this was really fascinating to me, particularly as a gender scholar, because one of the sort of world-leading gender scholars, Judith Butler, describes this concept of performativity in very similar terms. Performativity is the process through which a person maintains a desirable social identity. So it's an act that it might include your language, your body, your body language, your physical appearance, your mannerisms. So Butler defines performativity very similarly to how Hull defines masking. It's a stylized repetition of acts which are internally discontinuous, a constructed identity, and a performative accomplishment that also entails the repetition of oppressive and painful norms. So I think that there's a lot that the field of sociology can offer to a better understanding what masking is and why it happens. So as we saw in the previous slide, masking isn't just about suppressing autistic traits, it's also about passing, appearing non-autistic. So again, we may sometimes use the terms high functioning or mildly autistic, but what's really happening is the person is flying under the radar, so to speak, to the extent that it's not immediately obvious that they are autistic. So for example, I might not flap my fingers in public. I might change my tone of voice to be very different to how it would be if I weren't in the presence of neurotypical people. And again, in sociology, one of our sociologists argues that passing involves the work of achieving and making secure the right to live in an elected identity, so in this case, the neurotypical identity, while providing for the possibility of detection and ruin. And this is really key here, because masking isn't just, fitting in with society and with neurotypical norms. It's evading detection and ruin, or I would argue that it's evading detection and ruin. So what does detection and ruin look like for an unmasked or unmasking autistic person? And I want to turn to research to address this. So a study by Cage found that only 7% of autistic people feel that they are accepted by society. A subsequent study found that the most common reasons participants gave for masking were fitting in and passing in a neurotypical world and avoiding retaliation and bullying. Another key social driver is the desire to obtain jobs and qualifications that autistic respondents feel are less accessible if they're visibly autistic. And many autistic people choose to stay in the closet in professional environments where they do find employment because they're likely to be socially excluded if they come out. So when we talk about that concept of passing and performativity, allowing for the possibility of detection and ruin, it's very clear that this masking is happening in part, at least, due to negative consequences for appearing visibly autistic. So this is really fascinating to me, because if we're talking about key issues surrounding autism as, how do we ensure autistic people can access a good education, can access work opportunities, can access social opportunities, we cannot simply place the onus on the autistic person to fit into society. We have to also question, how is society excluding autistic people? How can society change to include autistic people? And this is a key area that I work in at my university as a project officer for neurodiversity right now. So in the second half of this presentation, I want to talk about how all this research and how all this theory actually relates in the material world. How do we make sense of this in a practical and hands-on way? So as a neurodiversity project officer, when I address this issue of masking and disclosure and why autistic people feel pressured to mask, I want to know what culturally and socially would be driving that process. So these are some of the questions that I asked myself as a very much masked and in the closet autistic undergraduate. Will my reputation suffer? Will my career suffer? Will I get a good supervisor for my PhD? Will my grades suffer if people assume that I'm less capable? I worried about having been bullied earlier in my life. Would those situations repeat? I was a permanent resident at the time. I was in the process of applying for citizenship. Would I lose my visa? Because right now there have been recent cases in the media where people are denied a visa because there's an autistic family member attempting to migrate. So for international students in particular, would that be a considerable factor in choosing whether or not to disclose? And in certain fields, could this even negatively impact the career overall? So particularly in caring fields with vulnerable populations, childcare, nursing, et cetera, would negative social stereotypes of autistic people negatively impact career progress if the person was out as autistic? So the question overall that I think a lot of autistic people ask themselves, they may want some reasonable adjustments. They may benefit from having the right to wear noise canceling headphones at work. They might feel like they'd like to tell people and try to seek more equitable inclusion, but do the benefits of disclosure outweigh the risks? Is it worth being able to wear noise canceling headphones if you might not get promoted, or if you might lose your job, or if you might be bullied or excluded? So I think it's really important that we address that issue. How do we make the benefits of disclosure outweigh the risks? So I want to talk a little bit about how we're trying to accomplish that at La Trobe through the Neurodiversity Project. And I've talked quite a few times, being a sociologist, it's really important to not just change the individual like we saw with the medical model, but we have to change the culture to account for diversity. we know at universities, we love to account for diversity culturally, with gender, with sexuality. At La Trobe, we have a city campus and we have regional campuses. So we even accommodate for regional diversity. But do we account for neurodiversity? Do we assume that it's our cultural responsibility to be an equitable institution? So I want to just contrast my earlier slide, the example of this medical model, with more of a social model of neurodiversity and autism. So in my model, I take the assumption, as we would in other fields of sociology studying, gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, and so forth, that rather than seeing one standard of normal that is inherently superior and then a series of disorders or inferior ways of being, we have to assume that there's diversity in society, and some groups may be privileged over others. So in this case, is the neurotypical neurotype privileged in that society and culture is built around that norm? And are other neurotypes, autism, ADHD, dyslexia, disadvantaged, not necessarily inherently or biologically, but environmentally, culturally, socially, legally, institutionally? And how do we address patterns of inequality? So it's a very sort of holistic approach in that there is not one easy answer to this, unfortunately. So I want to break down a little bit how we approach cultural change in the Neurodiversity Project at La Trobe. So I will break down each one of these sort of dot points, if you will, separately. One of the key things we focus on is inclusion and representation. So it's our neurodiversity portfolio is obviously led by an autistic person, which is myself, but we're also working with other neurominority groups at the university and setting up things like working groups to ensure that that representation results in community-led initiatives. What does the community need? What does the community want? Not what we think we should prescribe to the community. So this helps to set a precedent for other staff and students who might be considering disclosing, because they can see that there are openly autistic and ADHD people at the university who are respected and succeeding and doing well in their careers and their academic pursuits. So I'm really grateful that the university has quite consistently backed these initiatives, and our Olga Tennyson Autism Research Center is kind of spearheading that and has been from the start, very much pro-autistic representation and collaboration in everything from research to the Neurodiversity Project. So cultural sensitivity and changing the narrative is also really important, because when we think about disclosure, when we think about unmasking, what happens after unmasking? You know, we had that question of, do the benefits outweigh the risks? So how do you address the risks? Part of how we're doing that is staff training and resources aimed at changing the narrative, shifting a little bit away from that medical model to maybe include some more social model informed approaches. So one resource we've created is a neurodiversity cultural sensitivity toolkit. So this is hosted on La Trobe's website. It's provided to staff and students, and it helps to kind of like change the understanding of autism and neurodiversity as it's historically been thought of, and try to bring in the views of the community on how we should change cultural understandings. Another area that's key here is equity and diversity. So we are, one of the things we're doing to try to enhance equity is equip academics with the skill sets that they need to support neurodiverse cohorts. So again, in the same way that we train academics to support LGBTQIA+ cohorts, to support gender diversity and women in the university and cultural diversity, we are providing neurodiversity ally and accessibility training that's rolling out across key areas of the university, particularly in areas where academics or professional staff would be working closely with neurodiverse cohorts of students. So again, one of the ways of changing the culture is to acknowledge that while, for example, with the example of listening, there is an accepted norm of how we do something, which is often informed by neurotypical behaviors, but is there an equally legitimate way of doing that that doesn't necessarily look neurotypical? So as an autistic person, if I'm not making eye contact with a lecturer while they're speaking to me, does that mean I'm not listening? Or can I demonstrate that I'm listening in other ways? So it's really more informed by like the idea of cross-cultural communication, I suppose would be a good metaphor. Another key area is teaching and learning. So again, we've worked on training courses, but we've also got workshops aimed specifically at academics, where we take a strengths-based approach and try to educate academics in how neurodiversity can be a benefit in the classroom. So if a student might struggle in certain areas, how can we address that with strengths-based approaches? So what autistic skills, for example, could contribute positively to an education? So we have a peer learning center in our library called the Learning Hub, where students can go and get academic advice and study support. And one of the demographics that we would look at training are the peer learning advisors to help them take a strengths-based approach rather than simply seeing something like autism as a weakness in academia. And in addition, how do we teach in neurodiversity friendly ways, which I think probably comes up quite often, that things that are good for neurodiverse cohorts are good for everybody a lot of the time. So addressing common problems that might come up, like if executive functioning is a challenge, how do we break problems down into steps? How do we make things very clear and manageable? And oftentimes this is good for all students and not just neurominority groups. And finally, of course, one of the key components here is environmental accessibility. So this is less of an issue with COVID, but we are trying to make sure that our campus is also more accessible from a neurodiversity perspective. So one of the things that we did was create neurodiversity accessibility checklists for several different types of events. So I often get contacted by different stakeholders in the university who want to organize an event. How do we ensure that it's going to be neurodiversity friendly, like a career expo or classroom or a lecture? And we now have these resources that we can equip staff with to make sure that they're playing their part. Finally, I think one of the most important things is, again, shifting away from this idea that autism or neurodiversity or any other neurominority group is inherently inferior, and shifting towards this idea of acceptance and celebration. So in the same way that our university would celebrate cultural diversity and celebrate gender diversity and other forms of diversity, we should be celebrating neurodiversity as well. So I was really, really pleased in April for neurodiversity celebration. Well, Neurodiversity Celebration Week, I believe, is in March, and then we had Autism Acceptance Month directly after that in April. Our very first openly autistic lecturer decided to publicly come out at the university and kind of lead by example and talk about how being autistic has been a benefit in his career. So I think that's been really powerful for some of the autistic students that I work with, to see that there are other people out there coming out, being openly autistic, they're celebrated by their peers and they're succeeding. And it's really, I think, in the context of a culture that is so often deeply immersed and intertwined with a medical model, it's really important, particularly for younger people, to see positive role models and see celebratory stories of autistic people or other neurominority groups who are out there excelling and doing well in their life and moving away from a sort of tragedy model, I suppose. So just to sort of reiterate and summarize, these are my final slide or two here. Typically within the medical model, and the expectation on autistic people to achieve social inclusion would be that they're able to pass as neurotypical. So the onus would be on the autistic person to act according to social norms by masking and achieve inclusion through assimilation. My approach and a sociological approach to this would kind of shift the onus off of assimilatory masking and put the onus on social networks and institutions and culture to facilitate accessibility, unmasking, and equitable social inclusion. So it's really about taking a cultural responsibility to facilitating inclusion, disclosure, and unmasking. And my final slide is really just to compare where we started. So the idea that we start with assimilation, but we move more towards social equity, as we have in several other examples for diversity in culture and society more broadly. So if you want to know more about my work or are interested in reading some of the resources that I've mentioned, you can check out advocateneurodiversity.com, and there are links to the resources there, and you can find out a bit more about that. So that pretty much sums it up for me.
Thank you, Beth. And if you want to close the slide set there,
Sure.
And do please feel free, anybody, to or maybe it's only ourselves that are on view, but I was going to say feel free anybody else to put their video on. Beth, your final slide there, the medical model versus the sociological model. Can you, I was going to ask you two questions maybe to discuss. One, is there ever a benefit where you think actually we should be moving or maintaining the medical model, or indeed trying to have a blend where the medical model is in some way superimposed on top of the social model? But maybe before you address that question, if you wanted to go back a step and maybe from your own master's experience, maybe just highlight for us the differences between the medical and the social model and in the other areas that they apply, because I think it is so important that we find a way of balancing the two of them.
Yep. So which question did you want me to address first? Sorry.
So maybe if you go back to your experience of your honours studies, where you were looking at, you know, I suppose from your sociological perspective, just describing to us how the social model differs from the medical model a little bit more, the implications for that, and then ending with, I'm wondering, you know, whether there ever is a benefit to maintaining a medical model.
Sure. So one of the areas that very much has maintained the medical model approach is certainly disability legislation. And it's interesting because disability legislation is kind of the definition of combining a medical and social model approach, because it does take the assumption that a person tends to be medically or inherently disadvantaged, but then it also takes that social approach of what is culture or society's responsibility in terms of leveling the playing field a little bit in response to that disadvantage. So, you know, if a student wants to claim disability services at the university, for example, it's still, the expectation would be that you disclose that you have a medical condition, and then the university has a legal responsibility to provide you with reasonable adjustments for disability. So that very much is still a traditional medical model, but I think it's infused with a social model in a way that it is overall beneficial for the individual. I think the one thing that I'd be conscious of in that scenario is ensuring that the staff who are responsible for creating those access plans and working with those students are culturally sensitive in the way that they engage with those students. So if the student doesn't want to be referred to as having autism, or doesn't like the medical language of that the staff is respectful of that, and understands that their job is to engage in a culturally sensitive way with the person in question.
Yes, I mean, I guess it is the idea that diagnosis can be useful if they lead to something for somebody, if they provide an avenue for extra help or improved understanding, or maybe a shorthand way where it conveys meaning to other people. But as you say, the importance is perhaps where I would see the medical model is that we need to kind of look a little bit more in terms of, you know, a diagnosis applies, but there's so many other components to it, multifaceted domains, you know, that we need to take into account, because, you know, I've heard it said, I forget who the initial quote was attributed to: when you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. The same is true with ADHD or depression, or indeed Irish or Australian. You know, we are so different, but nonetheless, that shorthand way gives you a little bit of, you know, advanced understanding perhaps. And it's just we have to be aware that we need to calibrate that as we're interacting with people, that our assumptions that we had ahead of time don't always stay. So certainly having a label or a diagnosis, could be very, very positive in accessing information and alternative supports and additional supports. You were talking about masking, and indeed one of the audience, Conrad, I suspect is a high school teacher, mentioned the negatives of masking, in that whether if you're trying to, as you say, fit in more, act normal, be more normotypic, whether that might be associated with additional stress for the young person.
Oh, certainly. And the research on masking, particularly the research that's come out in the last 3 to 4 years, is really highlighting the negative consequences of masking for autistic people. And that ranges everything from higher rates of anxiety, depression, unfortunately, suicidality as well. Quite a significant toll on personal well-being, sense of belonging, sense of identity. And indeed, one of the most recent articles that's been published on that issue, although I'm not sure if it was correlated directly to masking, it did mention masking as a potential driver, but the question of whether autistic people also experience factors of minority group stress, and how that can sometimes help to explain lower overall social, emotional, and medical well-being for minority groups.
Yeah, I think this slide that you showed up there about the listening, as a lecturer, people listen and, they look animated, but other people are doing what you might have perceived as, no, they're not listening, they're disinterested, which obviously the whole thing about communication is this reciprocal nature of it, and how we fine-tune our responses based on what we feel is coming, which is why the Zoom has been quite difficult, especially if you're trying to teach students who, for perhaps understandable circumstances, aren't able to turn their cameras on. It's very hard to gauge that. But it reminded me of hearing, a father talking about his child, where one of the difficulties is where they felt they were really pressurized through treatment programs to get their child to look at them more as part of communication. And this is Conrad's idea of stress, that ultimately, while the child was doing that, to try and pay attention to looking as part of the communication, it distracted them so much, and the stress associated with looking at somebody's face that was changing all the time meant they couldn't actually take in what was being said to them, and that the communication load actually diminished. So I guess it comes back again to the balance of, doing something that fits your own skill set best, so that you get out of what it is that you want to get out of it. But at the same time, not being marginalized because what you're doing is not understood by the other person. So I think that simple slide you had, I would imagine in a school setting, in a lecture setting, even indeed in a personal communication setting, is very important. We should not assume too easily. And perhaps what we need to be doing more is clarifying, if a person isn't looking at us, to check, are you okay? Are you following what I'm saying? Do you think there's ever a time where masking might be beneficial, and where actually indeed trying to have some kind of balance where somebody does pass with the larger group, whatever it is, whether it's adolescents going out together and they all wear the same clothes, whether it's me when I'm with people feigning interest in sports, I've no interest, but I want to fit in for that particular session, engagement. So do you think there are times where masking should be encouraged?
So I think, if I'm understanding correctly, there are sort of two parts to that question. One being, do I think that there are situations when masking can be beneficial? And two, do I think it should be encouraged in some settings? And I think I would give very different answers depending on specifically how that question is worded. So in terms of whether masking can have benefits in certain situations, I want to, before I acknowledge this, I do want to say that my lived experience as an autistic person is informed by my identity and its intersectionality in my cultural context. So I'm white, I'm middle class, I'm educated, and I have privilege in those ways. And so because of that privilege, I might be more able to unmask in certain settings than other people. But when you look at the intersectionality of masking or unmasking, and when you listen to, for example, Black, Indigenous, and people of color speak about why they mask, of course there are benefits, because there are situations where things like violence might be more likely to come into play, where, recent stories in the news where police violence has very much come into play because autistic behaviors have been misread or criminalized through the lens of racism. So I think masking obviously has survival benefits in some ways, but do I think that it should be encouraged as the answer to those problems? Not necessarily, because I think we need to address the underlying inequalities that perpetuate the need to mask, whether it's in an education setting, a workplace setting, or due to other factors that are intersectional and related to other social identities. So I think it's a very complex question to answer.
I'm thinking about, and would be interested in, how you might have this discussion with parents, but many times in a clinic, part of the reason a parent might bring a child for assessment is because they feel they're ostracized in a class setting, they're not fitting in, they're on the periphery, they're on their own. And a lot of the interventions, the early interventions, is about optimizing eye contact, pro-social play, teaching social skills, not just to individuals who identify or have been identified as autistic or neurodiverse, but to a large group of individuals who have acknowledged they have social skills deficits or understanding language deficits. But what might you say to a parent who's coming to a clinic and says, my child doesn't look at me when I'm talking to them, they're not playing with their friends. Do you think that, given that we're in a society where at the moment there's a huge, ignorance about the neurodiversity and the different, the whole diversity approach that you mentioned, and that maybe some settings are much more medically model driven than others, and certainly you mentioned huge areas of intolerance to differences, but in that current climate, what might you advise parents concerned about young children?
I would advise any parent that's concerned about their child and the question of whether or not to teach masking or to what degree to teach masking to engage with the autistic community, because there is a lot of information out there that is really quite readily accessible online, where different demographics of autistic people speak about their experiences of masking and unmasking and how that relates to their experiences of equality or inequality. So and I also think when you read those stories, it can become very evident that while masking might to some degree allow a person to avoid some of the stigma and discrimination that's associated with autism specifically, oftentimes the stigma just comes from other labels. So as a woman, I can speak that my experience of masking very much related to my gender. I wasn't diagnosed until my 20s. So I masked very successfully for a long time. And obviously I still do. Like, I'm masking to some degree to seem professional and engaging right now. But as an undiagnosed and masking woman, perhaps I wasn't recognized as autistic, but if my tone of voice wasn't doing the right thing, I was labeled as bitchy, or I was seen as bossy, or I was seen as odd or weird or obsessive. I was seen as many other things that are stigmatized elements of autistic identity. They were just given a different label. So masking is not necessarily the solution to that. We do have to look to society and address why those behaviors are so stigmatized. And again, weigh up the pros and cons, because we know that the cons of masking include anxiety, depression, lack of identity, suicidality. If those are the cons, is that going to outweigh some of the benefits of maybe just receiving a different label for the same behaviors perceived differently?
There's one other question I might pose to you, Beth, before maybe asking my colleagues Ken and Dawn if they would like to put some of the audience questions to you. And that is David Milton's concepts of double empathy, which
Sure.
I looked at some of your YouTubes before interviewing you today, and very, very interesting work that he has done and brought a new insight. For the audience, could you describe that a little bit to us and maybe highlight why that concept of double empathy might be so important, and what, you know, I was going to say the clinical relevance, but I'm mindful that's a very medical term as well, but what the impact of that research might have in a broader area?
Sure. So I'll preface this by saying that sometimes as sociologists, particularly when it comes to theories, and Milton is a sociologist, oftentimes our expertise can be quite niche in theory. So for example, because I studied Judith Butler, I might be called a Butlerian, but I'm not. I don't know what the equivalent would be for Milton, but I'm not an expert in Milton. I just, so I don't want to speak on behalf of Milton by any means. I would encourage you to read Milton's work, but I can give you a very basic understanding of it. So Milton's work on double empathy tries to address some of the issues in terms of what I would have probably referred to in my presentation as like that cross-cultural communication that can happen between different neurotypes, and the idea that there's this stereotype of autistic people lacking empathy because they cannot make sense or intuitively understand neurotypical social norms and communication behaviors. So the idea that if I say, "Are you upset?" and you say, "No, I'm not upset," I'm supposed to know you're upset. The idea that I would lack empathy by not intuiting that. But the double empathy problem would say that neurotypical people may also struggle to intuit autistic social norms. So it's really the idea that there are different cultural norms for communication between different neurotypes. And the idea that autistic people lack empathy inherently is problematic and should be problematized, because a lot of that is actually tied up in dominant and privileged social norms that are based on neurotypical behaviors. I hope I've explained that okay. Feel free to ask for clarification.
I'm just wondering whether we were more aware of that concept of double empathy, whether that might lead to a reduced need for masking, because, you know,
absolutely.
situations with that, you know, first of all, awareness that, you know, we present ourselves in a certain way, but, you know, the understanding that other people will as well. And as I say, it goes back maybe to that, just fine tuning your engagements as you are engaging or lecturing or working with individuals. And Ken and Dawn, I might pass it over to you, Ken. I think you might take up some questions from the audience.
Indeed, thanks very much. Thanks, Beth. It was really a wonderful presentation. Just a question that one that came in from Anne Marie, and she was sort of saying, what do you think about, because this is sort of maybe the opposite of asking what you were talking about, what do you think about people falsely identifying as autistic in order to gain disability status, as in pretending to be autistic? I've met people like this. I find it confusing. I'm autistic myself. The diagnosis was a relief and helped me get the help I needed.
So thank you for your question. I think overall, and I'm not going to claim, particularly if you've had an experience where you've met someone who has openly admitted that they've lied about being autistic. By no means going to challenge that experience, but I think overall, and I've encountered this quite a bit in some of the work that I've done as well. There's a lot of there is a lot of fear or moral panic almost, I suppose, about people misrepresenting their disability status or I suppose the idea of we can't make it too easy to get disability support because people will rort the system if we do. And the idea that it's better to have it too hard than make it too easy. But I think, unfortunately, if that's the focus, what often ends up happening is people who very much need that disability support are not able to navigate the systems in order to get access to it. So it ends up excluding genuine cases more than it does excluding false cases, I suppose. So my view on that would be, I do think the system should be accessible and navigable to people who genuinely need it. And anecdotally, not that I've read research on this, but anecdotally, I haven't seen a high prevalence of people falsifying autism status, and I think there's a lot to lose from claiming to be autistic, and a lot of people would be dissuaded from doing so due to the stigma and discrimination that they could experience.
Thank you. Will I go with the next question, or did Beth want to go with one?
Are you continuing, Ken?
Yeah, okay. Just was one in there from Ali. You mentioned about the terms mildly autistic and severely autistic, which are very common terms used in research, medical, and even social settings. Could you please elaborate on your opinions about this regarding why you do not particularly agree with the usage of those terms?
Sure, absolutely. So when we speak about the terms mildly or severely autistic or high functioning or low functioning autistic, there tends to be criticism from a significant proportion of the autistic community because they're very medicalized terms that place the onus on functioning on the individual. So when we think of the autism spectrum, if you think back to the comparative slides of the medical model that I showed you versus the sort of neurodiversity model where we have majority groups and minority groups, this idea of a linear spectrum would tend to take the same approach that different or minority is inherently deficient. So if you have neurotypical up here outside of the neurodiversity spectrum, but then you have a spectrum of disorders, mildly assumes the capacity, a greater capacity to assimilate with a privileged and dominant norm of neurotypical functioning, whereas severe would say very incapable of passing as neurotypical or functioning within those norms. So they're criticized because they overlook the very significant role that culture and society plays in shaping functionality. So different terms that people can prefer are, for example, I prefer the term for myself, support needs as opposed to functioning. So higher, low, or complex or simple, complex support needs, or low support needs, or I suppose there was one other point I wanted to make there, and I'm hoping I'm not going to lose it. Oh, yes, of course. So the other issue that people tend to have with them is it assumes a static level of functioning over time, whereas functioning can be highly dependent on the social setting, the environment, what types of supports are being offered. So if you're mildly or severely autistic, that's seen as something that will not change over time. Or if you're high functioning or low functioning, whereas functioning is often dependent on setting. Like I sometimes have non-speaking episodes where I'm not able to give a talk like this at all, but then other times I'm quite a competent and hopefully engaging professional. So it's very dependent on what supports are being offered and what cultural adjustments are being made. I hope that explains some of the criticisms.
Well, thanks very much. Just a general question. And obviously just one of the things we have here in Ireland is, that one of the difficulties around, neurodiverse conditions is that they can be regarded as invisible, as you look at the person and you don't see them. And in Ireland, for autistic, dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, there's a lot of people going into third level that have not been diagnosed. So what are you doing in La Trobe to help people identify as neurodiverse, considering that there can be a stigma around the conditions?
So what are we doing to help people figure out that they might not be neurotypical?
Well, what you find is, I mean, particularly for ADHD, and studies are showing this, that as further to go through the education system, the more challenging it becomes. 4-year degree takes 8 years. So again, they're only figuring out, somewhere along the unit or the third level process, oh, I have a neurodiverse condition.
Okay, so one of the things that we're doing, I suppose all of the things we're doing would hopefully be contributing towards that, but I can actually tell, I suppose, an anecdotal story of a time where we've actually helped somebody realize that. I was delivering a neurodiversity ally and accessibility workshop to our Department of Politics and Philosophy. So as you can imagine, perhaps a department with a higher than average prevalence of autism, given the academic expertise. However, one of the things we did in that workshop, and I do in all workshops, this was pre-COVID, but we pass around a bucket of fidget toys and encourage everyone to take one, whether or not they think they'll need it, just to normalize it for the people that do need it. And I'm quite happy to say this because this colleague has disclosed this publicly online in a blog, so I think it will be okay for me to say it. But my colleague Ben Habib kind of came into consciousness that he was autistic in that seminar after listening to what I presented about autism and speaking about it so differently than how he'd ever heard it described, and understanding what that fidget toy meant to him in that room. He's present, he's listening, he's engaged for the first time in years. He feels like he's really able to pay attention in a meeting. So I think just anything that is going to change the narrative away from the sort of like tragedy model, because people aren't going to look for themselves necessarily in a negative model. So I think when you start to change that narrative and people can see that neurodiversity is by nature diverse and they don't need to look like the stereotype they've seen in the news or on TV, that's going to help with self-identification in a positive way.
Okay, thanks very much. I think Beth has Dawn has the next question.
Hi, Beth. Just wonderful presentation again. Just to echo, there was just a question there from Mary Louise. Do you have any advice or resources about how the workspace can be physically, aside from socially, more inclusive and improve equal opportunity for a neurodiverse person to thrive?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of changing the physical environment, I'm just making sure I understand every question because I can sometimes struggle a bit with the verbal processing. But just to make sure I'm understanding, the person asking wants to know how the workplace can change physically, like the environment can be more accessible? Yeah. Okay. Yes. Great. So, so one of the main things that can help is to reduce overhead lighting. So offer the opportunity to have a desk lamp, for example. Obviously, open plan offices are kind of like the worst case scenario for many people with minority neurotypes. So obviously, like the more private the space, the better. No overhead lighting, ensuring that if the person, for example, would work better with noise canceling headphones or listening to music, let that be okay. I've even seen an example where there were little stand-up booklets on desks that had different emojis for different moods, like please don't distract me, I'm working on a deadline, or smiley face, feel free to approach me. So little things like that where the social cues don't need to necessarily be intuited, but also the person isn't going to be distracted if they might struggle with regaining attention afterwards. So some of my colleagues have actually done research on this. So if you look for resource architecture and neurodiversity, one of my colleagues wrote quite an interesting article on that that should be available online.
Very good. There's another question here from Charlene. How do you think that neurodiversity works in conjunction to cognitive behavior therapy modules?
So how does neurodiversity relate to cognitive behavioral therapy? So I'm not trained in psychology. I have a very rudimentary understanding of CBT, so I'm not sure I can give a very detailed answer to that, unfortunately. It's just not my field of expertise. I apologize.
No problem.
If I could just chip in as a clinician there with CBT. The whole premise is really encouraging reflection and making the link between how your behaviors and your mood states are very much influenced by your thoughts, so that it's kind of making it a little bit more transparent to both the individual and indeed to other people. And I imagine, personally, I feel irrespective of having any psychiatric diagnosis, I think all of us should be engaging in CBT on a regular basis. And I certainly know there's some countries, like for Brazil, for example, where it's almost the norm to have therapy, you know, to optimize areas that you feel are your weaknesses. Because as you say, we're all neurodiverse in different ways. And so it's about you identifying where you think you are doing less well than you'd like to be, and whether there's something you can do about it. So I don't think that, you know, it's not something that can happen. However, to think about thinking, you do need a certain amount of cognitive ability. And so, you know, CBT is generally reserved for those that are a little bit older who have developed that developmentally, and those, you know, that have a certain intellectual capacity that allows them to hold that concept of thinking about thinking in their heads.
Just maybe just go, maybe just a couple of last questions for Beth. And obviously just from the sign there, I'm from ADHD Ireland, so there was an ADHD question, so I was obviously naturally drawn to that one. It sounds like progress has been made. However, it's likely to take a long time before acceptance of the neurodiverse population, or of neurodiverse population. So what can a parent do now for their ADHD late teen, who's never really been accepted or accepted his late diagnosis, wants to be neurotypical, and who continually masks at the cost of his own anxiety given his challenges? Thanks, from Marie.
That's an excellent question. I think, as someone myself who really, really struggled to accept my autistic identity early on, it is a process, and I think it's very natural to have some degree of grief over the person who you thought you were, who you thought you might become. And that grappling with that is, I think, an important part of creating a positive identity, because it is a total paradigm shift in how you understand yourself and your life. So I do think that can be healthy to a degree. But I think what is really profoundly life-changing in reconceptualizing that identity as a positive thing is engaging with the community and seeing other people who are like you, and who aren't being presented or represented by an outside group. So, I mean, when most representations that we would see of something like autism or ADHD aren't being made from the perspective of someone who lives that life, and they're not necessarily accurate or positive. They're often based in stereotypes. So one of the things, for example, particularly if it's a teen, there's a massive community on TikTok, which is, for those who don't know, it's a video sharing app where there are whole communities of ADHD and autistic people and so forth who share information and videos about what it's like. There's like memes and different jokes, and it's a really can be a very profoundly positive way to find a peer group of people who see themselves positively and their identity positively, and are able to communicate that in a way that is culturally relevant, particularly to a teenager. So I would definitely try to check that out. There's, if you Google TikTok ADHD, there's actually articles, like news articles on those types of communities, and there are different hashtags you can try searching to find people talk about their lived experiences.
Okay, and maybe just one last question, just for myself. Would you be able to reference the resources or research that you mentioned into changing the environment? Just maybe just put that as a two-part question. Just going back to the very end of your presentation, came in the first question from Nikki. What was your website references for your materials as well?
Oops, sorry, I was muted there. I'm
Yeah.
just seeing if I can try to find the link and I can maybe pop it into the chat, the
Okay.
resource architecture link, and then I can link you to my website as well. So I believe, yep, I can share to all panelists and attendees. So this is a link to the resource architecture article on neurodiversity that I mentioned. They're an excellent team with an interest in neurodiversity from different standpoints of architecture, design, and I think created some really interesting work on that topic. And my own website, I will grab the link to that as well. So my own website, I will pop that into the chat box as well. So if anyone wants to check that out, please feel free to. And most of the articles that the personal articles I mentioned will be linked on there if I've created them, as well as TikTok. You can also find on my website, because I do have a TikTok profile where I make little videos and resources which can be beneficial both to autistic people, but also the families or loved ones or support networks of autistic people who might want to know how they can support them better.
Okay, I think that it's just come to me to close the session today and to thank Beth very much for giving up your time. It's getting late into the evening there. And Dawn and Ken, thank you very much for also co-hosting with me. And to all the attendees that have attended, I hope, and I'm sure it will have, I hope the session will have been helpful to you. I hope that the ongoing discussions that we're trying to have, not just in UCD in Ireland, but across the globe, with regards to just, I suppose, making the world more inclusive in general, and encouraging people ultimately to have a fulfillment and a contentment, and to be able to be happy about that. So I look forward to maybe seeing some of you again on the 26th of August. That's the next masterclass we're having. It's at 11 o'clock. And my guest speaker on that occasion will be Sonia Gergler. So again, Beth, thanks very much and take care.
Thanks so much for having me.